Christ in Me. The year was 1980, and I was a senior at Parkland High School in Orfield, Pennsylvania. If you type in Parkland High School Millennium Falcon, you will get a picture of the architect kind of got cutesy. If there's an aerial shot of my high school, well, it's not my high school. They built a new high school after I left. They needed to. No, just kidding. But Parkland High School, 1980. And the year was one of the regional youth conferences sponsored by the Wesleyan Church. Remember, there was, and matter of fact, they're still going on. They're now called Follow. And there was an international convention in 1978 that I went to in Urbana, Illinois, then 1980 in Toronto, 1982 back in Urbana, Illinois, and then 1984 in Hershey, Pennsylvania. But the one I want to talk about is 1980 Toronto, Ontario, and I got to see Niagara Falls in the winter. That was quite exciting, which was quite the sight. And youth conference was great. They had several bands there, and one of them was a local band. But it was a moment in time that I will never, ever forget. The speaker for the final rally was Dr. Jimmy Johnson. Now, this is Dr. Jimmy Johnson a little bit later in life, 1992. But one of the things that Jimmy Johnson did when he came to speak at youth rallies, when he used to come to the youth conventions, he would not dress up like all the others in suits and ties, back in the days of suits and ties, but he would come with bib overalls and a t-shirt. He was very unique. Jimmy Johnson was the first youth pastor ever hired in the Wesleyan Church. He was hired by Pastor Orville Butcher of Skyline Wesleyan Church in California. And he was well known within the Wesleyan Church. And that day, he spoke about hearing the call of God to the ministry. And that morning, in December of 1980, I accepted God's call into the ministry. My youth leaders were really excited. They were like, wow, that's so great, Dale. You're feeling a call to the ministry. That's awesome. I was not quite so sure. I shared a little bit in Sunday school that I was quite the shy, introverted 17-year-old. In my mind, I was not the ideal candidate for ministry. For one, I did not enjoy speaking in front of people. In fact, I used any excuse I could to avoid speaking in front of people. But here in 1980, I accepted God's call to the ministry. And at least in my mind, the call to ministry involved something musical. That should not surprise you. Because I was comfortable as long as I was singing in front of people. As long as it wasn't talking in front of people, I was good. But singing in front of people, that was kind of cool. I could get involved that. And as long as I was playing my bass guitar, I was as comfortable as all get out. And so I spent the next several years in bands. This is a band that I was in called Jeremiah. So that was early on, and then. But nothing ever seemed to happen. It seemed like we could just never, the bands could never get their act together. And so I'm like, okay. So in the fall of 1985, I was working at AT&T in Allentown, and I got laid off. And so I was like looking for something. I was like questioning a lot of things in my life. I knew that this was 85. I was questioning about what God was doing in my life. Pam and I were dating at the time, and in the fall of 1985, all of a sudden it was like, okay, where is God leading me? I even told Pam at one point, I'm like, I just need to take a break for a couple of weeks. But as you can see, that break didn't last very long, and we're still together. I was made aware of an opportunity to travel with a Christian group out of California called the Continental Singers. And there, I am tucked way over in the pink shirt, way over on your left. I'm playing my bass. And And so and at the same time, I ended up working in the call center for a company called Daytimers. And both of these were part of God's training process. Being on the phone all day, talking to strangers, placing orders. Let me tell you about the very first phone call I took when I worked at Daytimers. We had 2 weeks of training, and they took us out there, and the supervisor was sitting right next to me. And the thing lit up, and you had to push the button to receive the call. And I said, "Thank you for calling Daytimers. How may I help you?" And I was shaking, and the pen was shaking. And I'm trying to take the guy's order, and lo and behold, I was so nervous about taking that phone call, I forgot to ask what color wallet he wanted, because they came in brown, black, brown, and burgundy. So I had to call the man back. Well, needless to say, what's really interesting about that story is that was in August of 1985 and it was a seasonal position working for a temporary agency. By the end of that season, in February, I was one of the last employees to be let go because of the great job I was doing, which was pretty amazing considering I don't like talking on the phone. Something that I still really have not gotten over. But working at Daytimers, being with Continentals, being placed on tour with 35 strangers and staying in a strange person's house every night, for 90 days, for a whole summer. Little by little, sharing the gospel night after night. Little by little, I saw the path more clearly, and God continued to prepare me, even without going to school. And trust me, I needed all of that. And so when I returned from tour in 1986, Dan Barry was the pastor of our church. Now, this is actually at our first church. Dan and Shelley and Pam and I think Dan was there to install me that day. Dan was the pastor at our church in Allentown, and he invested in me and my beautiful new bride at the time in 1987. And God confirmed that, and he confirmed that God indeed was calling us into the ministry. But I still thought that this ministry was going to be purely musical in nature. So in 1993, and some of you who are here for Sunday school know that today is 30 years of that day that we moved to Marion, Indiana, August 6th of 1993. And I studied for the music ministry. And then 1998, we took our first church in Flint, Michigan. I was the worship and fellowship pastor. That was my job. That was my official title. But in the year 2000, God called me to a preaching ministry to a beautiful little congregation on the southern end of the Adirondacks in New York that was so patient with their new, untested, and still untrained pastor. I had like 3 classes in what it meant to be a pastor by that point, or not even, I think 2. And it was there in Fort Miller that I started attending Flame classes and then was ordained in 2005. It was a 25-year journey from 1980 to 2005 of the God calling and qualifying me. And during that time, I had seen others accept God's call and be involved in the ministry and then fall away from the ministry. And as I stand in front of you today, 30 years ago, God started the journey, and here we are today. And ministry has always been part of my life. From the time I was this high, I was singing with my mom and dad. I sang in church. I went to church every time it was open, so that meant Sunday school, worship, youth group, and Sunday night service, all on Sunday. So most of Sunday was spent in church. Tuesday night was CYC. How many remember CYC? Not too many remember CYC, but CYC was on Tuesday night. Wednesday night was prayer meeting, so we were there again. And sometimes they would have business meeting after prayer meeting. So, and then there was spring revival, there was fall revival, there was 2 weeks of VBS, there was camp meeting, and so I was in church all the time, but God was calling me to the ministry. all the way up, even in youth group. And I look back and I still can't believe what God has done in my life. There are days I feel, even today, there are days I feel a little bit more like Jonah running from God's call. Sometimes I felt a little like Moses and said, Lord, I'm slow to speak. I can't speak well. I'm not a good speaker. I can't speak for you. And even at times today, I still feel unqualified. But this much I know. God called me to the ministry in 1980. So that's 43 years. But this year marks 25 years of ministry. And I'm grateful. And you might think, well, Pastor Dale, you're boasting. I'm not boasting this morning. Let me take you to the words of Paul. They're found in 1 Corinthians 1:24-28. But to those called by God to salvation, both Jews and Gentiles, Christ is the power of God and the wisdom of God. This foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans, and God's weakness is stronger than the greatest of human strength. Remember, dear brothers and sisters, that few of you were wise in the world's eyes, or powerful or wealthy when God called you. Instead, God chose the things the world considers foolish in order to shame those who think they are wise. And he chose things that are powerless to shame those who are powerful. God chose things despised by the world, things counted as nothing at all, and used them to bring to nothing what the world considers important. As a result, no one can ever boast in the presence of God. And I stand before you today to say this: I am not in the ministry today on my own power. I would have never made it this far. Over the last 40 years, God continues to work in me. It is Christ who lives in me and gives me strength. And it really is amazing as I look at what the power of Christ has done. The kid who in junior high, this kid I'm talking about, who was mercilessly harassed by my peers. I wouldn't go back to junior high for $1 million. Not on your life. I hated junior high. I wasn't much a fan of high school either, except the fact that by high school, at least I was enjoying band. I was playing French horn in the band, and I was just enjoying that, and playing trumpet in marching band and jazz band, and just had that going for me. And then there were my friends at church, my friends in high school at church, and wonderful youth leaders. Barry and Audrey Long were two of them. Another one is Eileen Lennox. Eileen McDonald was her name at the time, but she went to marry a guy named Steve Lennox. Just to show you how sometimes the world is so small, today Steve Lennox is the president of Kingswood University up in Sussex, New Brunswick, which is pretty cool. And we got to see Steve at the last gathering, and I got the chance to talk to Eileen, and I said, Eileen, I want to tell you how much you and Cheryl Zahn was another person who greatly influenced me. Two high school, they were seniors in high school, and they, along with my youth leaders, invested in us young ones, 9th grade, 8th grade, 7th grade, and they invested us, and I'm here because of them. Through my friends there and my wonderful youth leaders, they reminded us that it is the power of Christ that lives in us. It is the same power that raised Jesus from the dead. And I love how Paul tells us how the foolish plan of God is wiser than the wisest of human plans. In the going back to 1993 and getting ready to move to Indiana, I remember telling my boss, I said, hey, I'm resigning from Daytimers. By this time, I had moved from the call center into a different type of call center, and then eventually on into the IT department at Daytimers, and I was doing computer work and even learning how to teach classes in computers. So I mean, this was all really cool. But there were people like, it's really dumb. I mean, you're not really even established. You have no. Why are you leaving and going to college? I mean, that's stupid. That's dumb. People tell me that. And to many, it seemed foolish to leave a comfortable job with a pension and health insurance, and we moved to Indiana and had nothing. Nothing. I've told you before that the Indiana years were lean, to say the least. But our daughters still finally remember those 5 years in Indiana, and people even there invested in us. Time after time, someone would shake our hand, and in the process, we'd end up with a $20 or $40 or $60 bill. Or they would give us vegetables out of their garden. We lived on zucchini and tomatoes. And God took care of us when the world thought we were foolish. Paul goes on to say that in God's God's weakness is stronger than our best strength. And I've found that true over and over and over again. When I am weak, he is strong. Listen to what Paul writes to the Corinthian church in his second letter. Each time he said, "My grace is all you need. My power works best in weakness. So I am glad to boast about my weakness, so that the power of Christ can work through me. That is why I take pleasure in my weaknesses and the insults and the hardships, the persecutions and trouble that I suffer for Christ. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And over the years, there have been many times that I have felt weak, that I felt like I couldn't do it anymore. And Paul reminds us, and maybe you are there, maybe you say, I can't do it anymore. I can't do it anymore. Paul reminds us that in those weak times, it is really Christ working in us and making us stronger. I love that line in the song that I sang before the message. How refreshing to know you don't need me. Amen? I mean, God doesn't need any of us. But then he says, how amazing to know that you want me. God doesn't need us to do his work. He loves us when we partner with him. He wants us to partner with him to do the work that he's called us to do, but we don't do it on our own. After all, if we are his, we are crucified with Christ. Paul writes in Galatians 2:20, "My old self has been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. So I live in this earthly body by trusting the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." This morning, I encourage you, as we get ready to receive the elements of communion, as we get ready to receive the body of Christ and the blood of Christ, that it is no longer I who live, but it's Christ who lives in me. And he gives me, and he gives you the power to live lives of holiness, lives of righteousness. And he also gives us the power to do works of service, to do what he has called us to do. If there is ever a person who is qualified to say this next statement, it's me. God doesn't call the qualified. I am proof of that. God qualifies the called. And he qualifies us through his power. Paul reminds Timothy, "For God has not given us the spirit of fear and timidity, but of power and love and self-discipline." It took me a long time to understand that. And there are still times that I struggle with fear and timidity. But it's important to note that that's not what God gives us. God gives us a spirit of power, a spirit of love, a spirit of self-discipline. And so as we receive the elements of communion this morning, the body and the blood, let us be reminded that the power of Christ lives in us and allows us to live for his glory.